So let's shift gears to Ukraine and potential nuclear war.
Oh, well,
it's a real good transition, right?
Good
right
segue.
there.
Yeah. Happy Thanksgiving, everybody. We're all going to die.
Now it's time for everybody gets to be super stressed. Let's talk about potential. We talked about what we're thankful for. Now let's just talk about how it could all get wiped out in just a second. So in all seriousness, I do think that this Ukraine situation is not getting enough media. You honestly would think it would be getting more given how close we are to really bad things happening. You and I texted earlier in the week that Britain and France are sending their advisors there. We definitely already have CIA people on the ground there. I would even bet that we've got special operations forces on the ground there, actual maybe non-conventional, but U.S. military types on the battlefield there.
We do. It's confirmed. Yeah.
Is it really confirmed? I mean, we have uniformed American military personnel there. I mean, it's just the war keeps marching to me in the wrong direction. And I found this soundbite, which just is an interview, I think on the BBC with Zelensky, talking about what the end of the conflict could look like. And that just for the people who are listening and watching, that Zelensky might be willing to cede Russian-held territory to Putin, but in exchange for them being granted access to NATO, which has always been a red line for Putin. So it's like, on one hand, here you have Zelensky saying, yeah, we'll cede some of this terrain, but we got to get access to NATO. Like, listen to him talking about this, and I want to get your reaction.
Well, one alternative, perhaps, again, this is reported from the United States, and it's fairly simple, really, is that Ukraine joins NATO, but Russia takes control and keeps the land that it has to date. Would that be a possibility?
Ніхто не пропонував нам бути в НАТО.
No one has offered us to be in NATO with just one part or another part of Ukraine.
Закінчити гарячу стадію.
That's for once.
Факт.
The fact is that it is a solution to stop the hot stage of the war, because we can just give the NATO membership to the part of Ukraine that is under our control.
Факт. Можна було б, ніхто не пропонував.
Yes, it could be possible, but no one offered.
Треба робити.
But the invitation must be given to Ukraine within its internationally recognized border.
Ви не можете давати тільки частині.
You can't give invitation to just one part of a country. Why? Because thus you would recognize that Ukraine is only that territory of Ukraine and the other one is Russia.
Тому я і сказав, юридично ми не маємо права.
So legally, by law, we have no right to recognize the occupied territory as territory of Russia.
І тут не можна помилятись.
And here we must not make any mistake.
Гарячу стадію війни.
But if we want to stop the hot stage of the war,
зонтик, амбрелу,
we should take under NATO umbrella the territory of Ukraine that we have under our control.
швидко. А далі
That's what we need to do fast. And then Ukraine can get back the other part of its territory diplomatically.
So he's not saying he's because it's being reported. I mean, I've listened to this several times. It's being reported as, yeah, look, we'll let Putin keep whatever he has now. Just give us access to NATO. I don't think Putin's ever going to be okay with that. But let's say, for example, that happens. Putin, he's never given that territory up. It's just not going to happen. And I'm not saying or advocating, hey, let's back down to Putin, right? Because that guy's a terrible, evil dictator. But this stuff all seems like a pipe dream to me, Bryan. Am I right? Am I wrong? Tell me what you're thinking.
Look, Zelensky's doing what he should do as a president of his own country, which is trying to defend its interest and only its interests. So he's doing what he is supposed to do, what his people elected him to do. That does not mean that we, our president and our Congress, and guys like Vindman and others in our Congress or in our political system, that we should do what Ukraine wants. So we have to step back and ask ourselves, what are our interests here? Because you are correct. For folks unaware, we have multiple CIA bases, 6 to 10 of them, depending on who you ask, inside of Ukraine right now. We have special operations forces inside of Ukraine right now. And yes, you're quite right to say the United Kingdom and France are both considering putting their own ground troops in Ukraine in addition to their own contractors. So this war is absolutely escalating in the wrong direction, obviously. So we should be asking, well, so why do we care what Zelensky wants or not? And ultimately, I think our play here is we want Europe to be stable so we can have good trade relationships with that continent and do we have peace. That's fundamentally what we want. So when we have a conversation with Putin, whatever the deal is, fine, but let's make sure that it is a lasting and a durable peace. That's the goal. That's the end goal. So that's why you might hear some people talk about it. In fact, I think some of Trump's people saying, let's create like a demilitarized zone through a good chunk of NATO, that DMZ becomes patrolled by European powers, and the rest of, or the rump of Ukraine does not become NATO. It just becomes this sort of buffer state with the DMZ, absolutely the buffer, as it were, between Russia and the rest of Europe. And that creates your peace. Now, that's a very unhappy outcome for a lot of people in Ukraine right now, of course. They're going to lose a chunk of their territory plus the DMZ. But they've also lost hundreds of thousands of their men, their young men, in a country with a demographic crisis that was already running out of men. And yes, what you heard this week from the Biden White House to multiple media outlets is that they're encouraging the government of Ukraine to lower their age requirement for the men that they're going to throw into this meat grinder from 25 to 18. And the reason that Zelensky and the government in Kiev have not done that to date is because they want those men to have babies and reverse the demographic crisis and decline. But if you're going to throw the rest of your young men into this meat grinder, you're not going to have any men left to populate the nation. And yet that's exactly what the West is now telling them. By the way, the Germans are also telling Kiev and Zelensky the same thing. So you got the entirety of the West telling Ukraine, throw your young men, all of them, into this fight. Well, that's interesting. Why? Why do we want Ukraine to bleed out in this war of attrition, which we know the Ukrainians are not going to win? They have less than 25% of the total population. In a war of attrition, if you are the 25%, your enemy is the 75%, you lose, absent some crazy weapon, which you ain't going to have because the Russians have a nuke. So this war of attrition was lost from day one. The Pentagon, the CIA, the White House, they all knew this from day one, which really starts to get into some dark conversation around why the West, why the United States would allow a war of attrition, knowing that it was going to slaughter the Ukrainian people, most of their young men.
Yeah, why? And now you see Putin threatening Ukraine and Zelensky with hitting some of their command and control centers with hypersonic missiles too. The West knows this, and yeah, it really does beg the question: why continue to throw Ukrainian men to the meat grinder and essentially wipe out their population? As you said, sometimes in a war of attrition, you get, well, all the time in a war of attrition, you get exactly that, attrition. And Ukraine is not in a position to withstand that. Russia just has more people, full stop. So what the hell, why escalate? You know, why escalate?
So what you're asking is what we should all be asking, $200 billion plus into this war. What's the strategy here? What's the end game? What's the goal? Well, we actually got some of that at the very beginning of this conflict in March and then again in April. Joe Biden and then the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, respectively, in March and April, said that the goal here is a regime change. You may remember Biden delivered a speech in Poland in March.
Yes,
of 2022.
We've got to talk more. That's a great regime change, because that's what it's. People forget about that, Brian.
Well, but that's only half of it. So regime change is the first part. That's the ultimate goal, as Biden laid out. The other half of it, which is what Secretary Austin said in April of 2022, is if it's not regime change, it is grinding the Russian military and the Russian state into such a weakened rump that it can be controlled.
Regime change in Russia, you're talking about, they want Putin out of there.
Well, it's either Putin remains. The preference would be that Putin is gone. Joe Biden made that clear in that speech in Poland. The next month, when Lloyd Austin said the goal is to degrade Putin's forces so that he can, quote, never do this again, sort of, end quote. So I'm paraphrasing, but it's darn close to the exact quote. So if we can't remove Putin, in other words, this is the strategy. If Biden can't and his team can't remove Putin, we're going to degrade his military to the point that he can't create any sort of military havoc ever again. Okay, let's just say that is the strategy. Can we be honest about that? And can we talk about it? And if that's the strategy, then that would make some degree of sense that the Pentagon and Western leaders in, say, Brussels or Paris and France would be willing to sacrifice every single last Ukrainian man for that mission. Okay, let's be honest about that. And now let's ask the Ukrainian people, are you happy? Are you okay with us using you and your men as our puppets? as our proxy fighters. Are you okay with that? Are we okay with sending 500,000, 800,000, 1 million Ukrainian men to their deaths? I mean, that's the conversation we need to have. And then we need to ask ourselves a question. Well, wait a minute. So Putin's not a good guy. Obviously, he represents his own interests and he's a megalomaniac. Got it. But that doesn't mean that we have to engage in endless war. There are other options, diplomatic options, like the DMZ and putting the French and the Russian, or the French or the British troops in the DMZ, etc. So are there other ways to deal with Moscow other than a war where the vast majority of men are slaughtered? And this isn't some hyperbole, by the way. We know in other wars, for instance, the three-nation war down in South America back in the 1800s, 90% of Paraguayan men died in that war. So you could have a situation where something like that happens, where you're talking about 95% of all the men of Ukraine gone.
God.
All right. If you were a mom or a dad in Ukraine, that's kind of bad. You would want the world to talk about that. Second, if you look at the men right now that are serving versus the men in Ukraine who aren't serving, there's a very important difference. Who's the cannon fodder in Ukraine right now? Well, the men who can afford about $10,000 to get out of Ukraine, to go into Poland, Germany, Romania, those are the rich men. So the men in Ukraine who are not fighting, they're the rich men. The poor men, whether it be in Kiev or mostly in the rural areas of Ukraine, that cannot afford $10,000. So they get snatched by the Ukrainian police, thrown into a unit, and those are the guys who are the cannon fodder, the poor and the rural. As we have seen countless times in our own country's history, as well as all around the world, that's who suffers. So this gets back then to the strategy. We want to use Ukraine as our puppet to try to degrade Putin. Okay, we're starting to get into this very State Department, Harvard, ivory tower conversation about getting out our maps and our pens and redrawing the lines of Europe. That sounds all lovely, like we've read in some sort of history book. But we're talking about lives, young men. You and I have talked about this, not just on your podcast, but otherwise. Mm-hmm. You and I have gone through this walk in this country's journey of the global war on terror. We know what it's like to have friends who die.
Yeah.
We know what it's like to have friends who lose arms and legs. We know what it's like to have them come back and their minds scrambled, to have them sit on our porches and talk about suicide. So we know what this cost looks like in a very real and a very personal way. We're not sitting at State Department headquarters or up at Harvard having a conversation about remapping the world. So that's what I think in this new administration. What I pray is that somebody represents those voices, irrespective of this big power play between Brussels and DC and Moscow and all that kind of stuff, that we remember a little bit of our humanity as we think about trying to find ways to engage in peace. That doesn't mean that we absolutely take war off the table. There is such a thing as righteous war. That's correct. But in this case, it's really important that we recognize in a war on attrition, Ukraine's not going to win unless we send in troops. And are we willing to do that? No, we're not. So why would you send another generation, 18 to 25-year-old men in Ukraine to their deaths? Because we want to puppeteer these guys so we can take out Putin or minimize or weaken his regime? Sorry, there are other ways to do that. And how dare our leaders in the West use these young men, these poor rural men in Ukraine, to do their bidding as cannon fodder? It's absolutely evil.